Don't waste my time. Fix it. Those were the words that cut through the operations center like a blade, spoken by a woman who had never once needed to raise her voice to be obeyed. Isabella Carter stood at the center of the room in a tailored charcoal suit, her arms folded, her eyes fixed on the man who had just walked through the door wearing a jacket stained with engine grease. Behind her, more than 50 of the world's leading engineers stood frozen at their stations, waiting for someone, anyone, to fix the catastrophe unfolding on the factory floor. None of them knew that the quiet, grease-stained man standing at the threshold had once designed systems more advanced than anything currently glowing on their monitors. 40 minutes later, a production line worth more than $300 million would roar back to life. 50 experts would lower their eyes to the floor in silence, and Isabella Carter would be left asking herself a single, haunting question. Whose genius had she just insulted? Carter Dynamics had spent 11 years building a reputation as the most advanced manufacturing company in the country, a name that appeared on government contracts, aerospace components, and medical devices trusted in hospitals across 3 continents. Isabella had inherited leadership of the company during a period of quiet decline, when older executives still believed that reputation alone could carry a business forward. She had rebuilt the company from the inside, replacing sentiment with discipline, replacing tradition with relentless modernization, until Carter Dynamics stood once again among the most respected names in advanced manufacturing. Every success she had achieved had been earned through control, through the refusal to leave anything to chance, and through a work ethic so demanding that few of her executives could match it for long before burning out or moving on. That reputation, built so carefully over more than a decade, now hung by a single thread. An international certification board was scheduled to arrive within 72 hours to inspect the company's newest facility. A fully automated production line built around artificial intelligence, robotics, and predictive manufacturing software that had taken almost 2 years and hundreds of millions of dollars to construct. The certification was not simply a formality. It represented entry into a tier of manufacturing partnerships reserved for companies capable of producing components with tolerances measured in fractions of a hair's width, the kind of precision required for aerospace navigation systems and life-sustaining medical implants. Carter Dynamics had staked its future on this single facility, positioning it as proof that the company belonged among the elite few capable of meeting standards that most competitors could not even attempt. If the inspection failed, Carter Dynamics stood to lose a multi-billion-dollar contract overnight, a contract that had already been factored into projections presented to shareholders months earlier. The company's stock, already fragile after a difficult quarter marked by supply chain delays and rising material costs, would collapse under the weight of a failed certification. Thousands of employees across 4 states would face layoffs, from the engineers who had poured 2 years of their lives into the facility's design to the line workers who depended on steady paychecks to support families who had no understanding of algorithms or robotics, only of rent and groceries and the quiet dignity of steady work. Isabella had built her entire career on precision and control, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt neither. The weight of every job, every contract, every shareholder expectation rested now on a machine that refused to explain why it had stopped. The trouble began, without warning, on a Tuesday afternoon. The automated line, which had been running flawlessly for months, simply stopped. Robotic arms froze mid-motion, suspended over half-finished components, like statues caught in some strange industrial museum. The conveyor belts, usually a blur of motion, sat motionless under the fluorescent lights, their surfaces still holding the last components they had carried before the system had frozen. A line supervisor who had been standing near the second station later described the moment as unnervingly quiet, as though the entire facility had simply forgotten how to breathe. Error messages began cascading across every monitor in the control room. Hundreds of them, contradicting each other, overlapping, refusing to resolve into anything that made sense. One screen insisted the failure originated in the cooling subsystem. Another blamed a network latency spike that no one could locate. A third simply displayed a string of characters that even the software engineers could not immediately translate. Alarms blared through the facility until someone finally silenced them, leaving only the eerie hum of idle machinery and the murmur of confused voices spreading from station to station like a current running through the building. Isabella had been in a shareholder call when the first message reached her, a single line from her plant manager that read simply, "Full stop on line 1. Cause unknown." She ended the call without excusing herself and was standing on the factory floor within 11 minutes, her heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete as she crossed the length of the building. She had seen equipment failures before, had weathered supply shortages and workforce strikes, and a dozen other crises that might have broken a less determined executive, but she had never seen an entire team of engineers stand helpless in front of a machine that refused to speak. Isabella called in every expert Carter Dynamics could reach. Engineers flew in from Germany, where the robotics firmware had originally been developed, arriving with hard drives full of proprietary code and an air of quiet confidence that had already begun to erode by the time they landed. Specialists arrived from Japan, representing the manufacturer of the precision sensors embedded throughout the line, men and women who had spent their careers perfecting components smaller than a grain of rice. Consultants came from Switzerland, veterans of some of the most complex automated systems in the world, brought in specifically because of their reputation for solving problems that had defeated everyone else. American software architects who had written the predictive algorithms sat hunched over laptops, running simulation after simulation in search of an anomaly that refused to appear twice in the same place. A team from South Korea, experts in industrial cooling systems, paced the floor with clipboards, checking thermal readings against specifications they had memorized years earlier. 50 of the sharpest technical minds money could assemble, gathered under one roof, drawn from 5 countries and as many disciplines, and not a single one of them could explain why the line had died. Hours passed. Coffee grew cold in paper cups scattered across desks, replaced again and again by an exhausted assistant who had stopped counting how many pots she had brewed. Diagnostic software ran cycle after cycle, spitting out reports that contradicted the reports before them, each new theory collapsing under the weight of the last. Someone suggested a firmware conflict, and the German team spent nearly 2 hours rewriting sections of code before confirming the theory led nowhere. Someone else blamed a power surge, prompting a full inspection of the facility's electrical systems that turned up nothing unusual. A third theory involved a corrupted machine learning model that had somehow taught itself the wrong parameters during an overnight training cycle, an idea that consumed the software team's attention for the better part of 4 hours before it, too, collapsed. Each theory was tested with the same meticulous rigor, and each theory failed in turn, leaving the room a little more frustrated, a little more exhausted, and no closer to an answer. As the hours stretched past midnight, and then into the following morning, Isabella felt her composure fraying at the edges, though she would never have admitted it aloud. She had not slept. She had not eaten anything beyond a few bites of a sandwich someone had left on her desk hours earlier, now stale and forgotten. She had fielded 3 calls from the board of directors, each one shorter and colder than the last. The final call ending with a warning she did not need to hear twice. By dawn, the 50 experts who had arrived with such confidence now sat scattered across the operations center, in postures of quiet defeat, some staring blankly at screens they had already studied 100 times, others simply resting their heads against their folded arms, out of theories and out of time. Meanwhile, far from the glass towers of Carter Dynamics headquarters, a man named Marcus Hale was finishing a routine repair job at a small bottling plant 2 towns over. He was 38 years old, quiet by nature, and preferred the solitude of independent contract work to the politics of corporate employment. He drove an old pickup truck with more than 200,000 miles on the odometer, its bed lined with worn tool cases and coils of spare wiring, the kind of vehicle that drew no attention in any parking lot in the country. He wore plain work clothes without a single logo or brand name, and carried a battered steel toolbox that had seen better decades. Its corners dented from years of being set down on factory floors, its clasps worn smooth from constant use. He was not a man who sought attention. He rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying, and even then he chose his words with the same careful precision he brought to his work. never wasting a sentence the way he never wasted emotion with a wrench. He had built a small but loyal client base entirely through word of mouth, technicians and plant managers who valued his work far more than his resume, which he never bothered to share. Most of them knew him only as the quiet man who could fix what no one else could explain. Arriving without fanfare, working without complaint, and leaving before anyone thought to ask him where he had learned to do what he did. He lived alone in a modest house on the edge of a small town. A house he had bought with his wife many years earlier, and had never found the will to leave, even after she was gone. He kept a small garden in the backyard, tended a workshop in the garage that held more precision tools than most professional laboratories, and spent his evenings reading technical journals that had nothing to do with the small repair jobs that paid his bills, chasing an intellectual curiosity that had never truly left him, even after he had walked away from the career that once celebrated it. Few of his clients ever saw that side of him. To them, he was simply a reliable technician who answered his phone, showed up on time, and never overcharged for honest work. Carter Dynamics had contracted with a third-party maintenance agency as a backup measure, a standard precaution for a facility of that scale. When the agency scrambled to find available technicians in the middle of the crisis, most of their top staff were already committed elsewhere. Marcus was, in truth, the last name on the list, called only because there was no one else left to call. He did not know the scale of what awaited him. He did not know that 50 of the most credentialed engineers in the world had already failed. He simply grabbed his toolbox, climbed into his truck, and drove toward the address he had been given. When Marcus walked into the operations center, the room fell into an uneasy hush. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Every eye in that vast, humming space settled on the man standing in the doorway, and for a long moment, no one said a word at all. Isabella looked him over slowly, the way one might inspect an unexpected delivery that had arrived at the wrong address. His jacket bore old stains of engine oil that no wash could fully remove. His boots were scuffed and worn thin at the heels. The toolbox in his hand looked as though it belonged in a museum rather than a facility filled with machines worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Its steel corners dented, and its paint chipped away from decades of honest use. Another repairman, she thought. Another pair of hands sent by an agency that had clearly misunderstood the scale of the problem. Another wasted hour in a day that had already swallowed too many of them. Somewhere behind her, one of the German engineers let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "What does he think he can possibly do here?" he muttered to a colleague, just loud enough to be heard across the quiet room. Another voice, this one American, added dryly that most of the people in that room held doctorates from institutions most people had never heard of, let alone attended, and that a man with a toolbox was unlikely to succeed where satellite-grade diagnostic software had already failed. A Swiss consultant near the back of the room simply shook her head and returned her attention to her laptop, dismissing the newcomer without bothering to look up a second time. The condescension in the room was not loud, but it was unmistakable, a quiet current of superiority that had settled over the space the moment Marcus crossed the threshold, as automatic and unthinking as the sneer that had crossed several faces the instant they registered his appearance. Marcus said nothing. He did not flinch, did not bristle, did not offer a single word in his own defense. Isabella stepped forward, her voice flat and cold, carrying easily across the silent room. "Don't waste my time. Fix it." It was not a request. It was barely even an instruction. It was dismissal, disguised as authority. Marcus met her eyes for just a moment, calm and unreadable. "I'll take a look first," he said simply, and turned toward the line without waiting for a response. He did not introduce himself. He did not mention his years of experience, because as far as anyone in that room knew, he had none. He did not argue, did not defend his presence, did not ask a single question about the diagnostics already run. He simply began to walk the length of the production line, slow and deliberate, his eyes moving across the machinery, with the quiet focus of a man reading a language no one else in the room could understand. Then, without explanation, he reached over and switched off one of the analysis monitors that a cluster of engineers had been huddled around for the better part of an hour. The room went still with disbelief. For the next several minutes, Marcus ignored every screen in the building. He did not open the artificial intelligence diagnostic reports. He did not review the predictive failure models the software team had generated overnight. He did not so much as glance at the mountain of data everyone else had been drowning in for nearly a full day. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the line slowly, his head tilted slightly, listening the way a doctor might listen to a patient's chest before ordering a single test. He placed a bare hand against the housing of one of the robotic arms and held it there, feeling for vibration. His eyes half closed in concentration. He crouched near a conveyor motor and studied the way the belt moved, watching for the smallest hesitation in its rhythm, the kind of irregularity that no camera or sensor had been calibrated to detect. He leaned close enough to the machinery to catch the faint scent of heated lubricant, breathing it in the way a sommelier might study a glass of wine, searching for the subtle trace of something scorched or overworked. He checked the temperature gauges mounted along the line, comparing readings from one station to the next, then studied the color of the indicator lights blinking above each station, cataloging every subtle variation in hue, the faintest shift from a healthy amber to something just slightly duller. A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the assembled experts. One of the software architects turned to a colleague and murmured that this was not 1980. An era when engineers diagnosed machines with nothing but their hands and their instincts before computers had rendered such methods obsolete. Another engineer suggested, not quietly enough, that the man was simply putting on a show, performing the kind of theatrical inspection that made for good television but solved nothing in the real world. Marcus did not react to any of it. He did not glance toward the voices, did not pause his work, did not offer so much as a flicker of acknowledgement that he had heard them at all. He crouched lower, retrieved a small magnifying loupe from his toolbox, an old brass instrument worn smooth from years of handling, and began examining the control panel mounted near the base of the third robotic station with the kind of patience that made the room grow uncomfortable in its silence. Minutes stretched past without a single word from him, and the laughter that had filled the room only moments earlier slowly gave way to an uneasy, watchful quiet. Minutes passed. Then, buried beneath a maintenance access panel that had clearly not been opened in months, he found it. A scratch, barely visible to the naked eye, so faint that it might have been mistaken for a manufacturing imperfection. Beside it, a soldered connection point that sat misaligned by less than a fraction of a millimeter, a deviation so small that no automated inspection system had ever flagged it as an anomaly. No one in that room, not one of the 50 specialists who had spent the better part of a day buried in data, had thought to look at the physical hardware with their own eyes. Marcus straightened slowly, and for the first time since he had entered the building, something close to a smile crossed his face. "I think I know what this is," he said quietly, and the room, which moments earlier had been filled with skepticism, suddenly went very quiet indeed. He began to explain, choosing his words carefully, in the plain and unhurried manner of a man who had spent years translating complex mechanical truths into language anyone could understand. This was not a software failure, he told them. It was not an artificial intelligence malfunction, and it had nothing to do with the predictive algorithms the software team had spent the night rewriting. It was not a power surge, and it was not a corrupted machine learning model. It was something far smaller and far easier to overlook. A microscopic resonance fault, occurring only under the specific thermal conditions the facility reached during extended operation. A single sensor, positioned near that misaligned solder point, had begun transmitting a corrupted signal after several million operating cycles, a signal so brief and so subtle that it registered as noise rather than error in every diagnostic system built to catch far larger failures. The room erupted in objection. Engineers pulled up graph after graph, insisting the data pointed elsewhere, that the failure pattern matched known software conflicts documented in previous deployments at other facilities across the country. One of the Swiss consultants argued that a resonance fault of the kind Marcus described would have shown up in the vibration analysis logs she had personally reviewed twice without finding any such anomaly. A software architect insisted that the timing of the failures pointed unmistakably to a scheduling conflict buried somewhere in the predictive algorithm, a theory his team had already begun rewriting code to address. Voices rose over one another. Charts were thrust toward Marcus, as though sheer volume of evidence might overwhelm a theory built on nothing more than a magnifying glass and a steady hand. The noise in the room climbing toward something close to chaos. Marcus waited until the noise settled, standing quietly at the center of the disagreement without raising his voice to be heard over it, a stillness that eventually drew every eye back toward him simply because he refused to compete with the volume around him. Then he asked a single question, delivered without any trace of defensiveness, in the same calm and unhurried tone he had used since the moment he arrived. "If your explanation is correct," he said, "then why does the failure occur only after exactly 19 hours of continuous operation, every single time, without variation? Not 18 hours. Not 20. Always 19, down to the minute, across every recorded failure in the maintenance logs, stretching back over the past several weeks." The room went silent. No one had an answer. Every model the software team had built accounted for dozens of variables, but not one of them explained the strange, precise consistency of that 19-hour interval. A detail so exact it could only be mechanical, not digital. "Give me 20 minutes, Marcus said, and without waiting for permission, he opened his toolbox and got to work. He removed a small module from the base of the third robotic station, working with the unhurried precision of a man who had performed the motion 1,000 times before. Though no one watching him had any way of knowing that, his hands moved with an economy of motion that seemed almost hypnotic to the engineers watching. No wasted gestures. No hesitation, each movement flowing directly into the next, as though his fingers already knew exactly what they would find before they found it. He adjusted the misaligned contact point by a fraction, so small it was difficult to see without the loop, then recalibrated the sensor's internal algorithm by hand, bypassing the automated calibration software entirely and instead relying on a set of manual overrides that most of the engineers in the room did not even know existed. A young technician near the front leaned toward a colleague and whispered that she had never seen anyone access that level of the system manually before, only through the automated interface. When he finished, he stepped back, wiped his hands against a cloth from his toolbox, and reached for the restart switch. His expression as calm as it had been the moment he first walked through the door. The room held its breath. 5 seconds passed in silence. Then 10. Then 30. Each second stretching longer than the last, as 50 pairs of eyes fixed on the line. And then, the robotic arms shuddered to life. Indicator lights across the facility flickered from red to a steady, reassuring green. The conveyor belts began to move, smooth and even, as though the entire ordeal had never happened. The artificial intelligence system resynchronized with the hardware in real time, error logs clearing themselves one by one until the diagnostic screen displayed nothing but a single word: normal. The line that had defeated 50 of the most credentialed engineers in the world for nearly a full day had been repaired in under half an hour by a man they had dismissed on sight. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Then, slowly, people began rising from their chairs, drawn toward the working line as though needing to confirm with their own eyes that what they were witnessing was real. A senior engineer from Japan bowed his head low, murmuring the word "amazing" under his breath. A German professor, a man known throughout the industry for his sharp tongue and his refusal to be impressed by anyone, simply whispered the word "impossible" over and over, as though repeating it might help him accept it. Isabella stood apart from the crowd, watching Marcus with an expression that had shifted entirely from the cold dismissal of hours earlier. She studied him now the way one studies a puzzle that has suddenly, unexpectedly, revealed its solution. And for the first time since he had walked through that door, she found herself wondering exactly who this man truly was. The crisis had ended, but Isabella's questions had only just begun. That evening, alone in her office with the lights of the city glowing beyond the window, she asked her assistant to pull whatever records existed on Marcus Hale. What came back left her staring at her screen in stunned silence. Long before he became an anonymous independent contractor driving a battered pickup truck between small industrial jobs, Marcus Hale had held the title of Chief Mechanical Architect at one of the most respected engineering firms on the Eastern Seaboard. His name appeared on more than a dozen patents, several of them foundational to the very kind of automated manufacturing systems Carter Dynamics had spent a fortune developing. He had designed production lines used by companies whose names appeared on the covers of industry magazines. He had received international recognition for innovations that, at the time, seemed decades ahead of their era. And then, seemingly without warning, he had walked away from all of it. Isabella dug further, making a handful of careful, discreet calls to contacts who had crossed paths with Marcus during his years in the industry. One former colleague, a woman who had worked alongside him for nearly a decade, finally offered an explanation, her voice softening as she spoke. Marcus had left the industry after losing his wife, a woman he had loved with a quiet, unwavering devotion that colleagues had often remarked upon. After her death, something in him had simply closed. He stepped away from the recognition, the patents, the conferences, and the spotlight that had once followed his every innovation, choosing instead a smaller, simpler life built around honest work that asked nothing of him but his hands and his attention. He took only the jobs that kept him steady, avoided anything that might place his name back in the public eye. Taka Place, Talcum Time, had over the years become almost invisible to the industry that once celebrated him. Isabella sat with that information for a long time after the call ended. The office silent around her, the city lights blurring slightly as she stared past her own reflection in the window. The following morning, she called an emergency meeting of the entire leadership team. Every senior executive at Carter Dynamics filed into the boardroom, uncertain of what had prompted the sudden gathering. Marcus was asked to attend as well, though he arrived in the same plain clothes he always wore, entirely unaware of what awaited him. Isabella rose from her chair at the head of the table. She looked directly at Marcus, and for a long moment, the room fell into an anticipatory silence, the kind that settles over a space when everyone senses something significant is about to happen. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice steady but carrying a weight it had not carried the day before. The room stirred with quiet astonishment. Isabella Carter was known throughout the industry as a leader who rarely bent, a woman whose composure under pressure had become something of a legend among her peers. To hear her apologize, openly and without qualification, in front of the entire leadership team, was almost as astonishing as the repair Marcus had performed the day before. "I judged you by your appearance," she continued, her eyes never leaving his. "I looked at your jacket and your boots, and I decided, before you ever said a word, that you had nothing of value to offer this company. I was wrong, and I was wrong in a way that could have cost us everything." Marcus offered a small, understanding smile, the kind of expression that carried no bitterness at all. "Everyone makes that mistake eventually," he said simply. "The important thing is what you do once you realize it." Something shifted in the room after that. One by one, the engineers who had laughed at him the day before crossed the floor to shake his hand, offering quiet apologies of their own, some more eloquent than others, all of them sincere. The German professor who had whispered the word impossible now extended his hand with something close to reverence, admitting that he had not examined a control panel with his bare hands in more years than he cared to count, and that the oversight had cost the entire team nearly a full day they could not afford to lose. The Swiss consultant who had dismissed him without looking up now asked, with genuine curiosity rather than condescension, how he had learned to diagnose mechanical faults with such precision, using nothing but instinct and a simple magnifying loupe. Marcus answered her plainly, explaining that machines, like people, tend to show their true condition long before any instrument confirms it, if only someone takes the time to notice. The atmosphere that had once bristled with condescension now carried a genuine, if slightly humbled, respect. Engineers who had spent the previous day treating him as an afterthought now lingered near him, asking questions about his methods, comparing notes, several of them openly admitting that the experience had reminded them why they had entered the field in the first place, long before credentials and conferences had begun to matter more than curiosity. Isabella watched the transformation from across the room, struck by how quickly a single act of quiet competence had dissolved barriers that titles and degrees had spent years reinforcing. Before the meeting adjourned, Isabella extended an offer she had been considering since the previous night. She wanted Marcus to join Carter Dynamics as a technical advisor, a role that would give him influence over the company's most critical engineering decisions. Marcus declined without hesitation. He valued his independence too deeply, he explained. And the idea of returning to a corporate office, with its politics and its scheduled meetings and its endless hierarchy, held little appeal for a man who had spent years rebuilding his life around simplicity. Isabella did not push. Instead, she offered a compromise. Project-based consulting, she suggested. An arrangement that would allow him to maintain his independence while still lending his expertise to the company when it mattered most. Marcus considered the offer carefully, weighing it in the quiet, deliberate way he weighed everything, and after a long pause, he agreed. In the weeks that followed, Marcus began working alongside Isabella and her engineering teams on a project basis, appearing when his expertise was needed and disappearing again once the work was done, returning to the quiet rhythm of his ordinary life in between. He continued taking the occasional small job for longtime clients, unwilling to abandon the simple, honest work that had sustained him through the hardest years of his life. Even as Carter Dynamics began offering him assignments that paid many times more than anything he had earned in years, the dynamic between Isabella and Marcus shifted gradually from wary distance into something that resembled genuine partnership. They argued, often, about design choices and priorities, each pushing the other to defend their reasoning in meetings that sometimes stretched long past the scheduled hour. Isabella pushed for aggressive timelines and ambitious specifications, driven by a competitive instinct that had carried her to the top of a demanding industry. Marcus pushed back when he believed those ambitions outpaced what the machinery could reliably sustain, never raising his voice, never backing down from a position he had reasoned through carefully, simply repeating his concerns with the same patient consistency until she either found a counter-argument or came to see the wisdom in his caution. But the arguments carried none of the coldness that had once defined their first meeting. Isabella brought a relentless drive for precision and ambition, a mind built for strategy and scale, capable of seeing how a single engineering decision would ripple outward across contracts and quarters and years. Marcus brought decades of hands-on intuition, an instinct for mechanical truth that no algorithm could replicate, the kind of understanding that came only from years spent with grease under his fingernails rather than theories on a page. Where one of them saw only data, the other saw the machine itself, breathing and imperfect, alive in a way that spreadsheets could never fully capture, and together they began to build something neither could have built alone, a working relationship grounded in mutual respect that neither of them had expected to find in the other on that first tense afternoon. Then, just as the company began to stabilize, a new threat emerged. One far more dangerous than a single malfunctioning production line. A rival firm, eager to seize the multi-billion-dollar contract that Carter Dynamics had so narrowly saved, began circulating rumors through industry channels and financial press. The claims were serious. Carter Dynamics, the rumors alleged, had falsified performance data on its automated manufacturing systems, misrepresenting the very technology that had impressed the certification board only weeks earlier. The accusation spread quickly, picked up first by a small trade publication, and then amplified across larger financial outlets within a matter of hours. Financial analysts speculated openly about the company's credibility, questioning on camera whether the celebrated turnaround Isabella had engineered was built on anything more substantial than clever presentation. Investors grew nervous, and within days, uncertainty had settled over Carter Dynamics like a fog that refused to lift, erasing a meaningful percentage of the company's market value before Isabella had even finished reading the first article. Marcus, working late one evening alongside the engineering team, noticed something the others had missed. A subtle irregularity buried deep within the facility's data logs, a pattern that did not match ordinary system behavior, the kind of inconsistency that might have gone unnoticed by anyone who had not spent years learning to read machinery the way other people read language. Someone, he realized, had deliberately tampered with the historical performance records, planting inconsistencies designed to look like evidence of fraud, small enough to avoid immediate detection but significant enough to raise doubt in the hands of anyone determined to find it. He brought his findings directly to Isabella, arriving at her office well past midnight, with his laptop tucked under one arm. And together, working through the night, they began tracing the corrupted data back to its source. They cross-referenced access logs, examined timestamps that did not align with legitimate maintenance windows, and slowly reconstructed the true sequence of events, piecing together a timeline that neither of them spoke about until they were certain of every detail. Coffee cups accumulated on the desk between them as the hours passed, the two of them falling into an easy rhythm of collaboration that neither had quite expected, Isabella's strategic instincts sharpening every lead Marcus uncovered, Marcus's technical precision confirming every suspicion Isabella raised. What they uncovered was damning, not for Carter Dynamics, but for the rival firm that had orchestrated the entire scheme, planting false data through a compromised third-party vendor in an effort to manufacture a scandal from nothing. A scheme that unraveled thread by thread under the combined scrutiny of two people who had, only weeks earlier, barely acknowledged each other's presence in a room. Isabella brought the evidence to the certification board and to the financial press with the same calm precision Marcus had once used to diagnose a failing production line. The truth unraveled quickly once exposed to daylight. The sabotage was traced back to its source. The rival firm's reputation collapsed under the weight of its own deception, and Carter Dynamics emerged from the ordeal with its credibility not only intact, but strengthened in the eyes of an industry that had watched the entire crisis unfold in real time. By the time the dust settled, Isabella's trust in Marcus had become absolute, built not on the strength of a single repair, but on weeks of steady, quiet reliability that had proven itself again and again under pressure. She began to understand something she had never fully grasped before: that the truest measure of a person had very little to do with the clothes they wore, or the credentials listed beside their name, and everything to do with the integrity they carried into a room when no one was watching. At the end of the year, Carter Dynamics held its annual company gathering, an event that drew thousands of employees from facilities across the country into a single grand hall lit with soft golden light. Long tables lined the edges of the room, decorated simply, without the extravagance that some competing firms favored for their own year-end celebrations, a restraint that reflected Isabella's belief that the evening belonged to the people who had earned it through their work, rather than to the appearance of success. Line workers who rarely left their facilities mingled with engineers and executives, all of them dressed in their finest clothes for a single evening, trading stories about the year that had nearly broken the company before somehow making it stronger. Isabella climbed the steps to the stage, and the room quieted in anticipation of the address that would close out one of the most turbulent years in the company's history. A year that had begun with a silent, broken production line and had ended with the company stronger and more respected than it had ever been. She did not speak about profit margins. She did not mention stock performance or quarterly projections. The numbers that had once dominated every address she had ever given from that stage. Instead, she spoke about something far simpler and far more difficult to measure. Success, she told the assembled crowd, does not begin with technology or capital or ambition. It begins with the willingness to see people clearly and to give them the respect they have earned, regardless of what they happen to be wearing when they walk through the door. She turned then and gestured toward the side of the stage, where Marcus stood in a jacket that, for once, bore no trace of engine oil. The room rose to its feet as thousands of hands coming together in applause that seemed to roll through the hall in waves. Isabella announced his new title before the entire company, Special Technical Advisor, a role created specifically for a man who had refused every conventional path the industry had tried to offer him, and had instead built something better on his own terms. The applause continued for a long while after Isabella stepped back from the microphone, and when it finally quieted, she and Marcus stood together near the edge of the stage, looking out over the crowd that had gathered to celebrate a year neither of them would ever forget. "Do you think we will still be working together a long time from now?" she asked him quietly. Once the noise had settled enough for conversation, Marcus considered the question for a moment, the way he considered most things, unhurried and deliberate. As long as the goal is still to build something worthwhile, he said, I will always be willing. Below them, on the factory floor 2 levels down, the production line hummed steadily along, its rhythm smooth and unbroken, the same line that had once ground to a silent halt in front of 50 helpless experts. Robotic arms moved in their practice sequence. Conveyor belts carried components from station to station without hesitation, and indicator lights glowed a steady, unbroken green from one end of the facility to the other, a quiet testament to a machine that had once defeated the best minds money could summon, restored instead by patience, observation, and a willingness to look closely at what everyone else had overlooked. There was no longer any distance between the CEO who had once dismissed a stranger at first glance, and the quiet engineer who had proven, without ever raising his voice, that true expertise rarely announces itself. What remained between them now was something steadier than authority and more lasting than a title. Respect, earned honestly through weeks of shared work, rather than granted through rank or credential. Humility, chosen deliberately by 2 people who had each, in their own way, learned something essential about themselves over the course of a single difficult year, and a trust that neither of them had expected to find on the day a man in a grease-stained jacket walked through a door and changed everything, proving that the most valuable expertise in any room is rarely the loudest, and that the truest measure of a person has never had anything to do with what they happen to be wearing when they walk in,